This is a fascinating topic because what we often think of as separate languages are in fact part of a deeply connected system. When we talk about Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese, we are not simply talking about four different languages. We are looking at a shared linguistic and cultural sphere that has developed over more than 2,000 years. This sphere is often referred to as Kanji Ken in Japanese, or the East Asian cultural sphere, a system built around the historical use of Chinese characters and the spread of classical Chinese as a written medium. What makes this especially interesting is that this system includes not just one form of Chinese, but multiple Chinese varieties, each contributing in different ways to the development of vocabulary, pronunciation, and cultural concepts across the region. In this presentation, I would like to explore how these languages are connected, how they differ, and most importantly, how learning one of them can significantly accelerate the learning of the others. To understand this system, we need to begin with its origin. The writing system at the heart of the East Asian cultural sphere originated in China with the development of Chinese characters as early as the Shang dynasty more than 3,000 years ago. What is important here is that this was not just a writing system, but a system capable of expressing complex ideas, administration, philosophy, and culture. Over time, this system did not remain confined to China. Through trade, diplomacy, and especially scholarly exchange, Chinese writing and culture spread outward, reaching the Korean Peninsula and Vietnam around the 1st century BCE. From there, the system continued to expand. It arrived in Japan around the 5th century CE, often through Korean intermediaries as well as Chinese immigrants and scholars, and with it Japan received its first writing system, which would fundamentally shape its language and culture for centuries to come. As this system spread, it gradually evolved into something more than a writing tradition. Between roughly the 7th and the 19th centuries, we begin to see the formation of a shared cultural identity across East Asia. At the center of this development was classical Chinese, which functioned as a regional lingua franca. It became the common written language for diplomacy, law, and literature, allowing scholars and officials from different countries to communicate within a shared intellectual framework. But this shared identity was not based on language alone. It was reinforced by a set of common cultural pillars, including Chinese-style administrative systems, Confucian ethical thought, and the spread of Mahayana Buddhism. These elements created a deep cultural cohesion across China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. At the same time, this system operated within a hierarchical worldview, often described as Sinocentric, in which China was seen as the cultural center. This perspective shaped regional relations for many centuries and remained influential well into the early modern period. For nearly 2,000 years, the East Asian cultural sphere operated under a remarkable system that we might describe as biliteracy. On the one hand, people spoke very different languages, but on the other hand, they shared a common written medium. This medium was classical Chinese, which functioned as a kind of scripta franca, a shared script for official communication. In this respect, it is very similar to Latin in medieval Europe. It was used for diplomacy, for administration, and for high-level scholarship across the entire region. One of the most fascinating aspects of this system is what were sometimes called brush conversations. Educated elites who could not speak each other's languages were still able to communicate fluently by writing to one another in classical Chinese. We can imagine, for example, a Korean envoy and a Vietnamese scholar meeting in Beijing. They might not be able to understand each other's spoken language, but they could exchange ideas, discuss philosophy or politics, and communicate with precision through writing alone. This shared script also created a set of universal standards. Legal codes, Confucian administrative systems, and even the Buddhist canon could be transmitted and understood across different societies within this shared framework. As Chinese characters spread across East Asia, they did not always fit easily with the grammar and sounds of local languages. Each culture had to adapt this writing system in its own way, creating unique solutions. Japan offers one of the most fascinating examples. At first, the Japanese used a system called man-yogana, where Chinese characters were used purely for their sound, not their meaning. In other words, kanji were used like phonetic symbols to represent Japanese words. Over time, this system proved too complex for everyday use. So gradually, these characters were simplified into two distinct writing systems. The first is hiragana, which developed from the flowing cursive forms of full Chinese characters. It became the script of grammar, poetry, and more personal or literary expression. The second is katakana, created by taking small parts or fragments of characters. It was often used by monks as a kind of shorthand, and today it is used for foreign words and emphasis. Together, these systems allowed Japan to fully adapt the Chinese writing tradition to its own language, creating a flexible and uniquely Japanese script. To understand the depth of this system, it is helpful to look at literacy in a modern context, and Japan provides a very clear example. In the Japanese education system, kanji literacy is developed in a structured and cumulative way. During compulsory education, from grades 1 through 9, students learn the full set of 2,136 Joyo kanji. In elementary school alone, students learn 1,026 characters, known as the Kyoiku kanji. Then in junior high school, they complete the remaining 1,110 characters. At the high school level, students do not simply learn more characters, but refine their usage and encounter more specialized vocabulary through literature and advanced texts. In addition, there is a separate category known as Jinmyo kanji, characters used in personal and place names. Many students become familiar with several hundred of these as well. As a result, by the time a student graduates from high school, they are typically familiar with somewhere between 2,400 and 3,000 kanji in total. If we move beyond the school system, we can ask what kanji literacy looks like at a highly educated level. For a university-educated adult or a specialized scholar, the number of characters recognized typically increases significantly. Many highly educated adults can actively read between 3,000 and 5,000 kanji. For specialists, particularly in fields such as history or literature, this number can rise even further, sometimes reaching as high as 6,000 characters. This level of knowledge is comparable to what is required to pass the highest level of the National Kanji Kentei examination. However, it is important to distinguish between reading and writing ability. In modern Japan, there is often a noticeable gap between recognizing characters and being able to reproduce them by hand. While many adults can read thousands of kanji with ease, they may still struggle to write more complex characters from memory. This is partly due to the increasing reliance on digital input systems, which reduce the need for handwritten recall. If we now look at modern usage, we can see how this system functions in everyday Japanese. One of the key features is the interaction between kanji and kana. Kana, especially hiragana, acts as a kind of grammatical glue. It is used for particles, verb endings, and other functional elements of the language. At the same time, katakana is typically used for foreign loanwords, such as computer for computer. Kanji, on the other hand, serves a very different function. It provides visual efficiency. Because written Japanese does not use spaces between words, kanji characters act as visual anchors, allowing the reader to quickly identify nouns and verb stems within a continuous stream of text. This makes reading much faster and more intuitive. In addition, for less common or more difficult characters, small phonetic kana, known as furigana, are often added above the character to guide pronunciation. If we look at the example here, we can see how kanji and kana work together within a single sentence. The kanji carry the core meaning, while the kana provide the grammatical structure, creating a highly efficient and visually organized system. If we now turn to Korea, we see a very different path within the same cultural sphere. For many centuries, Korea shared the same system we have been discussing. During what we might call the Age of Diglossia, for over 1,500 years, Hanja, or Chinese characters, was the primary means of writing. Spoken Korean and written Chinese coexisted, much like other societies within the East Asian cultural sphere. But in the 15th century, a major transformation began. In 1443, King Sejong the Great introduced Hangul, a phonetic writing system designed to be simple, logical, and accessible to the general population. This was a remarkable innovation, one of the most scientifically designed writing systems in the world. However, the full transition did not happen immediately. For several centuries, Hanja and Hangul continued to coexist. It was not until the 20th century, particularly after the Second World War, that a decisive shift occurred. Both North and South Korea moved toward the exclusive use of Hangul. In North Korea, Hanja was banned from official use as early as 1949. In South Korea, the process was more gradual, with Hanja being phased out of schools and newspapers beginning in the 1970s. As a result, modern Korean today is written almost entirely in Hangul, marking a clear departure from the earlier shared writing tradition. Korea followed a very different path. For over 1,500 years, the Korean language was written using Hanja, Chinese characters. This created a situation known as diglossia, where the writing system did not fully match the structure of the spoken language. Then, in 1443, one of the most remarkable linguistic innovations in history took place. King Sejong the Great introduced Hangul, a completely new writing system designed specifically for the Korean language. Unlike Chinese characters, Hangul was phonetic, logical, and intentionally simple, so that ordinary people could learn to read and write. However, the transition was not immediate. For centuries, Hanja and Hangul coexisted. The major shift came in the 20th century. After World War II, both North and South Korea moved toward almost exclusive use of Hangul. In the North, Hanja was banned from official use as early as 1949, seen as a relic of the past. In the South, the process was more gradual, with Hanja being phased out of schools and newspapers beginning in the 1970s. Today, Hangul stands as one of the most efficient and scientifically designed writing systems in the world, and a powerful symbol of Korean identity. If we look at the results of this transition in Korea, we can see a very different picture of character knowledge today. For the average adult, especially among younger generations, knowledge of Hanja is quite limited. Many may recognize only 50 to 100 characters, and some may even struggle to write their own names in Hanja. At the same time, there is still a group of highly educated professionals, such as lawyers, historians, and scholars of traditional medicine, who maintain a much deeper knowledge. For them, knowing 2,000 to 3,000 or more characters is still expected. But this creates a noticeable gap within society, and this leads to an important and ongoing debate. A significant portion of Korean vocabulary, often estimated at between 57 and 70%, is derived from Chinese roots. As knowledge of Hanja declines, some argue that younger generations are losing access to the deeper structure and meaning of academic and technical vocabulary. This has led to what some describe as a literacy crisis, not in the ability to read Hangul, but in the ability to fully understand the historical and conceptual foundations of the language itself. If we now turn to Vietnam, we see yet another path within this shared cultural sphere. For nearly 1,000 years, Vietnam operated with a dual writing system. At the official level, Classical Chinese, or Chu Han, functioned as the scholar's script. It was used for government administration, historical records, and legal documents for many centuries. But alongside this, a uniquely Vietnamese system began to emerge. This was Chu Nam, developed around the 13th century as a way to represent the Vietnamese language more directly. It combined Chinese characters and newly created forms to capture both sound and meaning in spoken Vietnamese. However, this system came with a significant challenge. Chu Nam was extremely complex. In order to read it effectively, one first had to master standard Chinese characters. This created a substantial barrier to literacy, limiting full access to written language to a relatively small, educated elite. This brings us to a major turning point in the Vietnamese case. Beginning in the 17th century, a new writing system began to emerge. This was a Romanized script developed by Portuguese and later French missionaries, most notably Alexandre de Rhodes. Their goal was to represent the Vietnamese language phonetically using the Latin alphabet. At first, the system was limited in use, primarily within missionary communities. However, its role expanded dramatically during the colonial period. Under French administration, the use of the Latin script was actively promoted and eventually mandated. This was not only a practical decision, but also a cultural one, as it helped to weaken traditional ties to the Chinese writing system and reshape the intellectual landscape. At the same time, Vietnamese nationalists themselves began to adopt and promote this new script. For them, it offered a tool for wider literacy, education, and modernization. As a result, Vietnam made a complete transition to the Latin-based writing system, marking a decisive break from the character-based tradition that had defined the region for centuries. Now let's look at how these character systems diverged in the modern era. At first glance, you might expect simplification to follow a single path, but in reality, Japan and China often simplified characters in completely different ways. Take the character for country. Both Japanese and simplified Chinese look similar here. They independently adopted the same shorthand, sometimes described as jade in a box. But then we see striking divergence. For wide or broad, all three forms are different. Japan simplified only the inside of the character, while China removed that inner component entirely. The character for dragon is another fascinating case. Japan preserved an older traditional variant, while China created a highly cursive simplified form. For book or document, Japan actually kept the traditional structure, while China reduced it to a much simpler four-stroke form. In electricity, Japan again stays close to the traditional version, preserving the rain radical at the top. China removes it completely. And in characters like medicine, all three systems, traditional, Japanese, and simplified, developed their own distinct shorthand forms. So what we see is not just simplification, but multiple independent solutions to the same problem. This is why learning one system helps, but never fully prepares you for the others. So what this table shows is simple. There's no single logic behind modern characters. Some forms converge, but many split in completely different directions. The result is a system where shared origins don't guarantee shared forms. And that's exactly why knowing one system only takes you part of the way. This slide illustrates one of the most powerful sources of synergy within the East Asian cultural sphere. What we are looking at here is shared Sino-derived vocabulary across multiple languages. At first glance, these words may appear quite different, but if we look more closely, we begin to see clear patterns. The same underlying characters carry the same core meanings across Chinese varieties, Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese. What changes is primarily the pronunciation, and this is where things become especially interesting. If we compare these words with modern Standard Chinese, the connections are not always immediately obvious. However, when we bring in Cantonese, a Southern Chinese variety, the relationships become much clearer. Cantonese often preserves consonant structures and phonological features that are closer to the forms that were historically transmitted into Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese. As a result, words that appear unrelated in Standard Chinese suddenly become recognizable when viewed through a Cantonese lens. This allows learners to move beyond memorization and begin recognizing patterns across languages, and this is exactly where the synergy lies. You are no longer learning isolated vocabulary, but a connected system that reinforces itself across multiple languages. This slide illustrates one of the most powerful sources of synergy within the East Asian cultural sphere. What we are looking at here is shared Sino-derived vocabulary across multiple languages. At first glance, these words may appear quite different, but if we look more closely, we begin to see clear patterns. The same underlying characters carry the same core meanings across Chinese varieties, Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese. What changes is primarily the pronunciation, and this is where things become especially interesting. If we compare these words with modern Standard Chinese, the connections are not always immediately obvious. However, when we bring in Cantonese, a Southern Chinese variety, the relationships become much clearer. Cantonese often preserves consonant structures and phonological features that are closer to the forms that were historically transmitted into Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese. As a result, words that appear unrelated in Standard Chinese suddenly become recognizable when viewed through a Cantonese lens. This allows learners to move beyond memorization and begin recognizing patterns across languages, and this is exactly where the synergy lies. You are no longer learning isolated vocabulary, but a connected system that reinforces itself across multiple languages. For example, the native Japanese word for water was mizu. The character for water was then used to represent that word. So in this case, the character carries a native Japanese meaning. The second layer is onyomi, or the sound-based reading. These are approximations of how the characters were pronounced in Chinese at the time they were borrowed. They are most commonly used in compound words, what we might call Sino-derived vocabulary. For example, in the word suiyobi, meaning Wednesday, the character is read as sui. This pronunciation reflects an older Chinese sound, preserved in Japanese like a kind of linguistic fossil, and this is what makes Japanese especially rich, but also complex. It preserves both the native meaning layer and the historical sound layer within the same writing system. Up to this point, we have seen a remarkable degree of shared vocabulary and a common writing tradition across the East Asian cultural sphere. However, beneath this shared surface, there is a fundamental grammatical divide. Despite sharing thousands of Chinese characters, these languages fall into two very different structural groups. On one side, we have Chinese varieties and Vietnamese. These are analytic languages. They typically follow a subject-verb-object word order, and they rely on word order, context, and tone to convey meaning. Words themselves do not change form. There is no conjugation in the way we see in many other languages. On the other side, we have Japanese and Korean. These are agglutinative languages. They follow a subject-object-verb structure, and they build meaning through grammatical endings, particles, and suffixes. In these languages, verbs and adjectives change form to express tense, mood, and politeness. So while the vocabulary layer may be shared, The grammatical systems are fundamentally different. And this is why learning one language in this sphere both helps and challenges you. You gain access to a shared lexicon, but you must still master a different grammatical logic. If we now focus more closely on Chinese varieties and Vietnamese, we can better understand their underlying grammatical logic. In these languages, a word behaves like a solid brick. It does not change its form regardless of tense, plurality, or politeness. This means there is no conjugation. For example, the word for eat remains the same whether you are talking about the past, the present, or the future. To express time, you simply add another word, such as already or tomorrow, or rely on context. This leads to what is known as an isolating structure. In this type of system, meaning is determined primarily by the order of the words. So word order becomes absolutely critical. If we take a simple example, I eat rice has a clear meaning, but if we reverse the order to rice eat I, the sentence either becomes nonsensical or changes the meaning entirely. So in these languages, grammar is not built into the word itself, but into the structure of the sentence. In sharp contrast to the more static structure we just saw, Japanese and Korean operate in a very different way. In these languages, verbs and adjectives behave more like living forms. They change their endings to express time, mood, and levels of politeness. This process is known as agglutination. In simple terms, you attach suffixes to the end of a word to modify its meaning. If you look at the examples on the slide, you can see how a single verb changes its ending to express eat, ate, and want to eat. The same pattern appears in both Japanese and Korean. Another important feature is that adjectives also behave like verbs. They change form to express tense. So instead of adding a separate word to indicate the past, the adjective itself is modified. As shown in the example, the word for cold is changed directly to express was cold. So in these languages, grammar is built directly into the word itself, creating a system that is flexible, expressive, and highly structured. Another key feature that links Japanese and Korean is their shared grammatical perspective. Both languages are what we call topic-prominent languages. This means that instead of focusing primarily on the subject, the doer of the action, they focus on the topic, what the sentence is about. This creates a structure that is quite different from English. In fact, Japanese and Korean are so similar in structure that they often function as mirror images of each other. In many cases, you can translate them almost word for word in the same order. A central element of this system is the topic marker. Both languages use a special particle that appears after the topic and sets the stage for the rest of the sentence. If you look at the examples on the slide, you can see how this marker functions in both languages. Its role is not to indicate the subject, but to signal to the listener, regarding this topic, here is the information. So rather than building sentences around who is doing the action, these languages often organize meaning around what is being talked about. Now here's something remarkable. Japanese and Korean share almost identical grammatical systems. Instead of word order alone, they use small markers attached to nouns to show function. Topic, subject, object, direction, possession. Different languages, same underlying logic. ESE markers act like labels, telling you exactly what each word is doing in the sentence. Even without recognizing vocabulary, you can often follow the structure. D. That's a powerful advantage when learning both languages together. Let us now look at a concrete example of this mirror-like structure. We will take a simple sentence, I go to school. If you look at the table, you can see how this sentence is constructed step by step in both languages. Rather than thinking in terms of a single English sentence, we can break it down into its functional parts. First, we introduce the topic, I. Then we mark it with a topic particle. Next comes the destination, school, followed by a marker indicating direction, or to. After that, we have the verb go, and finally, a marker of politeness. What is striking is that both languages follow exactly the same sequence. Each element appears in the same position, serving the same function. So rather than translating ideas, you are often simply aligning structures. This is why learners frequently find that once they understand one system, the other feels immediately familiar. Here's the key pattern. Japanese, Korean, and Chinese are head last. The description comes first, and the noun comes at the end. Everything builds toward that final word, student. Vietnamese, on the other hand, is head first, just like English. The noun comes first, and the description follows. Let me briefly summarize what we have seen. First, there is a powerful vocabulary advantage. A large portion of academic vocabulary is shared across these languages, so learning one helps unlock the others. Second, Japanese and Korean share a very similar grammatical structure. Once you understand one, the other often feels familiar at a structural level. And third, Chinese characters provide a visual bridge. Even when pronunciation differs, the meaning can remain accessible. So the key idea is this: learning languages in this sphere is not just easier, it is cumulative. Each language you learn strengthens your ability to learn the next. Thank you very much for your attention. As we have seen, these languages are deeply connected through history, structure, and meaning. Different languages, shared heritage, endless connections. I hope this perspective encourages you to continue exploring the richness of the Sinosphere. Thank you.
If you're passionate about languages and cultures, head over to polyglotdreams.com, where you'll find my memoir, A Life in 30 Languages. It's available in multiple languages, including dual language editions and versions with audio narration, perfect for learners who want to combine reading and listening for deeper study. In this memoir, I share my adventures in 99 countries to the date I wrote the book, along with insights on how to learn languages best, drawn from my own experiences and research as a professor of cross-cultural management. Whether you're a polyglot, a language learner, or simply curious about the world, it's a resource to inspire and inform. So don't forget to visit Polyglot Dreams, the link is in the description, to explore the memoir and expand your language horizon.